Ever wondered what it was really like to rule a kingdom? The crown, the power, the luxury. Sounds amazing, right? Well, think again. If you think being a medieval king or queen is all feasts and glory, you're in for a shocking surprise. From constant rebellion to a kingdom's fragile survival, let me show you why you wouldn't survive a single day in those royal shoes. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into something you probably haven't thought much about. The brutal, gritty reality of being a medieval ruler. Forget what you've seen in movies or read in history books. We're about to explore the terrifying truth behind the royal life. I'm going to take you through a real day in the life of a king, and trust me, it's not as glamorous as you think. From endless pressure, constant threats, to a kingdom on the brink of collapse. If you were thrown into this world, you wouldn't last 24 hours. Stick around, because by the end, you'll be thanking your lucky stars you're not wearing that crown. The sun's harsh rays pierce through the stained glass windows of a vast, opulent chamber. The heavy scent of incense clung to the air, mixing with the distinct aroma of parchment and old stone. The cold stone floor beneath the bed seemed more real than the soft velvet sheets that wrapped around the body of a figure in slumber. The figure stirred, blinking, a sense of confusion clouding their thoughts. A sharp, unfamiliar voice echoed in the room, pulling them from their dreamless sleep. "Your Majesty, you are awake!" The words hit like a thunderclap, jolting the protagonist out of the haze of sleep. They bolted upright in the bed, the sudden motion making their heads spin. Panic surged through them. This wasn't their room. It wasn't their body. They weren't in their time. A mirror hung on the opposite wall, its golden frame gleaming in the morning light. It was only when the protagonist's gaze met their reflection that the truth crashed over them. The face staring back wasn't their own. A regal, proud face stared at them, adorned with the deep hues of royal robes. Long dark hair cascaded around a crown that seemed far too large for the modern-day person who had just taken control of the body. "Who? What is this?" they murmured, their voice not quite their own, deep with authority but also tinged with confusion. "Your Majesty," the voice again, this time softer and more insistent. "The council is waiting for you." The protagonist turned toward the speaker, an older man, dressed in fine clothes that screamed the wealth and status of the palace. He bowed deeply, as though the world depended on it. The protagonist looked around, still in disbelief, struggling to connect the surreal images before them with any sense of reality. You are... I'm not... They stammered, trying to make sense of the situation. "This isn't my life. I don't belong here." The advisor did not seem surprised by their reaction. Instead, his face hardened into a practiced mask of professionalism. "It is your life now, Your Majesty. There is no time for confusion. Your kingdom is in peril." The protagonist's mind whirled, trying to grasp the situation. "Kingdom? Peril? But I'm not..." "You are the Queen, Your Majesty. Queen Arwenna of Leontar." The words hit like a slap. Queen? How could this be? They were just an ordinary person from the modern world. Nothing prepared them for this. The idea of ruling a kingdom, of sitting on a throne surrounded by advisors, nobles and enemies alike, was beyond their comprehension. Yet, here they were, in a body that carried the weight of an entire nation's future. They swallowed hard. The shock was overwhelming. With trembling hands, they reached for the golden crown sitting beside the bed. It felt cold to the touch, like the weight of the world was wrapped in its delicate filigree. "Tell me what's happening," they demanded, trying to sound authoritative. It wasn't their voice, but the instinct to control, however desperate, was strong. The advisor hesitated. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something that the protagonist couldn't quite place. The kingdom is on the brink of civil war. Your cousin, Prince Gaius, has raised an army to challenge your rule. We've received word that he's planning a coup. The realization hit them hard. This was no ordinary day. This was life at its most perilous. A kingdom in turmoil, a coup brewing, and the protagonist, the Queen, had to navigate through it all. They couldn't even imagine what royal duties or court politics entailed, let alone battle a hostile faction aiming for the throne. Suddenly, the weight of the crown seemed more like an anchor than a symbol of power. "I don't even know what to do," the protagonist muttered, a sense of panic rising in their chest. The advisor gave a thin, knowing smile. "That is why you have us, Your Majesty. The council has already prepared strategies for dealing with the rebels. We can ensure your safety. We will protect you." The thought of being protected by these strangers, who seemed to know more about this life than the protagonist could ever hope to, only made them feel more isolated. They were lost in time, a modern soul trapped in a medieval monarch's body, and everything about this life felt like a cruel joke. There was no way to escape it, no way to turn back. Another voice, more distant, called from the hallway. "Your Majesty, the nobles await your presence. The council meeting must begin." The protagonist hesitated, their fingers gripping the edge of the bed as they tried to steady their racing thoughts. They weren't prepared for this. They weren't prepared for anything. "I'm not ready," they said quietly, almost to themselves. But the advisor had already moved toward the door, not waiting for a response. "It is time, Your Majesty." Before they could protest, the advisor opened the door and ushered them out into the grand hall, where voices murmured from within. The protagonist, feeling a strange mix of dread and adrenaline, stepped forward, walking into the unknown. The weight of their new position pressed heavily on their shoulders, a constant reminder that this was not a dream. This was real. And as they crossed the threshold of the grand hall, they could only wonder if they had just stepped into a nightmare that would never end. The grand hall was a stark contrast to the frantic chaos whirling inside the protagonist's mind. As the heavy doors creaked open, the cold draft of stone and marble filled the room, the silence only broken by the occasional murmur of the nobles waiting in anticipation. Eyes turned toward the newcomer, the Queen, the woman who would dictate the kingdom's fate, the woman who didn't even know how she'd come to be here. The room's golden chandeliers shimmered in the daylight, streaming through tall, arched windows. A long, ornate table stretched before the protagonist, lined with nobles, advisors, and military leaders. They all rose in unison, bowing low in reverence. It was surreal. These were people of power, each with their own ambitions, fears, and secrets, and yet they were looking at her, waiting for her command. "Your Majesty," a deep voice boomed from the table. An older man with a thick, greying beard stood and gestured to the seat at the head of the table. "Please, take your place." Her legs felt like lead as she moved forward. Every step was heavy, her heart racing as her mind struggled to comprehend the reality of the moment. She had been plucked from an ordinary life and dropped into the seat of unimaginable power, but with power came responsibility, and the overwhelming weight of it threatened to swallow her whole. As she sat, the voices of the nobles quieted, and the room seemed to close in around her. She felt their eyes on her, the weight of their expectations, pressing against her skin. "Your Majesty," the advisor from earlier, Lord Eldrick, spoke up, breaking the silence. "We face a critical decision. Prince Gaius is rallying forces in the north. The time to act is now." The protagonist blinked, trying to steady her breathing. "Prince Gaius?" The name sent a cold shiver down her spine. If what the advisor said was true, this man, this relative, was plotting against her. But the deeper question remained. Why? Why would someone so close to the throne want to see her fall? "Yes, Your Majesty," Lord Eldrick continued, his voice laced with urgency. "We must decide how to respond to his uprising. We have 3 options. 1, to negotiate with him and attempt to reach an agreement. 2, to send our armies to confront him directly. Or 3, to wait and watch, hoping his rebellion will collapse on its own." But if we do nothing, it could embolden him to take more drastic action. The protagonist felt the heavy gaze of everyone in the room. Her mind raced, trying to grasp the complexities of the situation. Negotiation sounded weak. Sending an army seemed reckless, and waiting. Waiting felt like surrender. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I don't know what to do. A murmur spread across the table, and she could feel the eyes of the nobles narrowing, some with impatience, others with barely concealed disdain. They were waiting for her to make a decision, to prove she was capable of leading. But how could she? She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared to be queen, let alone make decisions that could lead to the death of countless people. I understand the gravity of the situation, Your Majesty, Lord Eldrick said, his tone softening slightly. But we must act swiftly. If we show any sign of weakness, Prince Gaius will seize the opportunity. The protagonist could feel the tension in the room, the pressure mounting with every passing second. They were all waiting on her, on her. She felt the weight of their expectations bearing down on her chest, a constant reminder that she was no longer the person she used to be. She was now Queen Arwenna, and this was her kingdom, for better or worse. I will not let this kingdom fall, the protagonist finally said, her voice unsteady but firm. We will send the army. Prepare the troops. A tense silence filled the room, and for a moment, the protagonist wondered if she'd made the wrong choice. But then the nobles began to nod, murmuring their approval, though some still looked uncertain. Perhaps they were waiting for her to falter, to show weakness, but she wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. As Lord Eldrick moved to relay the orders, the protagonist's thoughts drifted. What have I just agreed to? The weight of her decision sat heavily on her shoulders. Sending an army into battle wasn't something she could take lightly, yet in this medieval world, there seemed to be no other choice. She couldn't sit idly by while her kingdom teetered on the edge of destruction. She had to fight for her crown. But in the quiet moments between decisions, doubts crept in. Was she doing the right thing? Was there any other way? Later that evening, after the meeting had adjourned, the protagonist found herself alone in her chambers, staring out over the kingdom's sprawling city below. The glow of the setting sun bathed the streets in an orange hue, casting long shadows over the rooftops. She could hear the distant sounds of the market, the life of the people, carrying on as if nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. She was a stranger in a foreign world, surrounded by people who called her Your Majesty, when she had no idea what she was doing. With a sigh, she collapsed onto the bed, the heavy crown pressing uncomfortably against her head. She closed her eyes, trying to escape the pressure for just a moment. But even in the darkness of her mind, the question lingered. Was it really worth it? The days blurred together, a whirlwind of decisions, strategy meetings, and sleepless nights. The protagonist, Queen Arwenna, was learning quickly that the throne was not a place of comfort, but of constant tension. Each passing day brought new challenges, from managing the threat of Prince Gaius in the north to the increasing tension within her own court. But nothing prepared her for the storm that would come from within her own bloodline. It was a late evening when the news reached her. A young page hurried into her chambers, his face pale, breathless from running. Your Majesty, it's urgent, the boy stammered, bowing low before her. Your brother, Prince Leander, he's in the palace, demanding to see you. The name hit the protagonist like a blow to the chest. Prince Leander, her only sibling, was once someone she'd trusted, someone she believed in. But as the years had gone by, they had drifted apart. Where once they'd been united under the banner of the crown, Leander had grown distant, bitter, with the way their kingdom had been ruled. Rumours of his ambitions had always lingered, but she never thought him capable of treachery. She stood quickly, her mind racing. Let him in. Moments later, her brother appeared in the doorway, his tall frame imposing even in the dim light of the chamber. His dark eyes were sharp, full of something that made the protagonist's heart race, a mixture of resentment and something darker. "Leander," the protagonist said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What is this about? Why have you come here?" He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, as though savoring the tension in the room. He didn't bow or show any respect. Instead, he met her gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. "You've made a mess of this kingdom, Arwenna," he said flatly, his voice low but full of contempt. "The people are restless, and now we face war, all because you couldn't see the inevitable." The accusations stung, but the protagonist refused to show weakness. She stepped closer to him, locking eyes. "What are you talking about?" Leander let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Don't play coy with me, sister. You're in over your head." Gaius. He's not the only threat. There are others who want the throne. People who have been whispering. People who have been waiting for a ruler like you to make a mistake. A chill ran down her spine. His words weren't just harsh, they were threatening. It became clear to the protagonist that her brother wasn't just upset about her rule. He was warning her of something far more dangerous. "I'm doing what I can to protect this kingdom," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll do whatever it takes to keep it intact." Leander's gaze softened for a moment, though the bitterness never fully left his eyes. "And yet, you make decisions without understanding the consequences. You've angered the wrong people. You've pushed them into the arms of Gaius. And now..." He paused, leaning in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Now you've sealed your fate." The protagonist's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. "What are you saying?" Leander smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile. "I'm saying you've lost their trust, Arwenna. The council, the nobles, they no longer see you as their queen. You've made too many enemies." The tension in the room thickened. For the first time since she had taken the throne, the protagonist felt the truth of Leander's words sink in. She wasn't just fighting external enemies, she was losing the support of her own people. The ones who had been her allies, her closest advisors, were now questioning her every move. Her own brother was hinting at something far more dangerous, a plot to dethrone her. Suddenly, she wasn't just the ruler of a kingdom. She was a pawn in a much larger game. "I won't let you do this, Leander," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You're wrong. I'll fight for this throne. I'll fight for the people who still believe in me." Leander's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "I hope you're right, sister. But remember this, every throne has its price." He turned to leave, but before he did, he paused in the doorway, glancing over his shoulder one last time. "You're not as safe as you think, and neither is your crown." As the door closed behind him, the protagonist stood in silence, the weight of his words settling over her. Leander's warning wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. He had chosen his side. And now, the protagonist realized, she was alone in the fight for her life and the future of her kingdom. The following days were marked by a growing unease. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening behind the scenes. Something sinister, something that threatened to unravel everything she had worked for. In the court, the nobles whispered behind her back, their words sharp, cutting. Each time the protagonist entered a room, she could feel their eyes on her, weighing her every move. The trust she had taken for granted was slipping through her fingers. Even her closest allies were becoming distant, their loyalty uncertain. Then, one evening, as the protagonist sat alone in her chambers, going over the reports of the ongoing war, a messenger arrived with a letter sealed in black wax. Her heart raced as she broke the seal and read the contents. It was a letter from Prince Gaius, an offer to meet and discuss a possible peace treaty. But there was something else. The letter hinted at a dangerous alliance, one that involved some of her most trusted allies. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Leander was right. There were conspirators within her own court, people she had trusted, working with Gaius to bring her down. Her brother's betrayal was just the beginning. The kingdom's future was on the line, and she had to make a choice. Trust no one, or risk losing everything she had fought for. The days of calm, however fleeting, had passed. The tension that had slowly crept into the court was now a palpable force, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Queen Arwenna, once a ruler gripped by uncertainty, was now thrust into a world where every decision had a cost that was becoming harder and harder to bear. Her kingdom was at war. Prince Gaius and his forces were closing in from the north, and with each passing day, more nobles turned against her. But the external threat wasn't the only battle she fought. The weight of the crown was beginning to feel unbearable, an oppressive force pressing on her every waking moment. It was late one evening when the toll of leadership became undeniable. The protagonist sat at her desk, the flickering light of the candelabra casting long shadows over piles of documents, strategy reports, troop deployments, letters from various allies and enemies. Each piece of paper seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 lives. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. Her body ached, her mind spun, and yet the demands never ceased. The courtiers, the generals, the council, they all needed her to make decisions, and they expected them to be right. The truth was sinking in. She was alone in this. There was no one she could truly trust. The advisor who had once promised to guide her, Lord Eldrick, was now a mere shadow, lost to the tides of political maneuvering. Even her closest confidants had become distant, their loyalties questioned. The only thing she could rely on was herself, but that too was beginning to feel like a curse. "Your Majesty," came a soft voice at the door. The protagonist looked up to see Lady Myra, one of her few remaining loyal servants. Myra was young, with striking green eyes, and a demeanor that was both sharp and gentle. "Yes, Lady Myra?" the protagonist asked, though her voice lacked its usual strength. She felt so tired. She felt so alone. "There's a message from the front lines," Myra said, stepping forward with a letter sealed in the royal crest. She placed it gently on the desk before the protagonist, her eyes studying the Queen's face with concern. The protagonist took the letter, but her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The message was brief and chilling. "Our forces have been ambushed near the northern pass. The enemy grows stronger. Reinforcements are needed immediately. The soldiers are weary and disheartened. We are on the verge of losing the battle." For a moment, all the air seemed to leave the room. The weight of the words hung like a shroud over the protagonist. The battle was slipping out of her grasp. The kingdom, her kingdom, was crumbling before her eyes. "Tell the generals to prepare reinforcements," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. But inside, panic was beginning to rise. Lady Myra nodded but lingered in the doorway. "Your Majesty," she said cautiously, Perhaps you should rest for a while. You've not had any true rest in days." I can't," the protagonist cut her off, her tone sharper than she intended. "I can't rest. There's no time for rest." Lady Myra didn't argue, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "As you wish, Your Majesty." With a deep breath, the protagonist turned back to the report, scanning it once again, but the words blurred. Her head was pounding. Every muscle in her body screamed for relief. This was too much. She wasn't built for this. She wasn't made to carry the weight of an entire kingdom on her shoulders. The next morning, she had barely slept when Lord Eldrick entered her chambers with more news. The tension was becoming unbearable, and the weight of it all was taking its toll. His eyes flickered with unease as he approached. "Your Majesty," he began, but there was no warmth in his voice anymore. "We've received troubling news. The enemy is massing their forces at the border. And do we have any reinforcements?" she interrupted. her voice tinged with frustration. Eldrick hesitated. "We've sent what we can, but, she pressed. "There are fewer soldiers available than we anticipated," Eldrick said quietly. "And morale is faltering. Some of our men are questioning their loyalty. They've heard the rumors." "Rumors?" The protagonist's heart pounded. "What rumors?" "There are whispers among the troops, Your Majesty. They're saying that you have no chance, that Gaius will win. They've heard of your struggles, of the betrayals within the court. They're beginning to lose faith in you." The words hit her like a physical blow. Betrayals, rumors, weak soldiers. How much longer could she hold on? "I'll have to take charge of the army myself," she said, her voice resolute despite the dread swirling inside. "Prepare the troops. We march at dawn." But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of her downfall. That night, she stood in front of the mirror once more, staring at her reflection. The crown, so heavy in her hands, seemed to mock her. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted this. Yet here she was. Her hands trembled as she placed the crown atop her head once more. But as she did, she realized that this crown, this life, had become more than a symbol of power. It was a symbol of sacrifice. And sacrifice, she knew now, came at a price. As the protagonist prepared to lead her army into battle the next day, the world outside her chamber felt colder. Her kingdom was on the edge of collapse, and the burden of responsibility weighed on her more heavily than ever before. But she had no choice but to continue. She was a queen, and queens did not retreat. But deep down, the fear gnawed at her. The cost of leadership was unbearable. And as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, she wondered just how much longer she could carry the weight of her crown. The battle loomed on the horizon, and Queen Arwenna stood on the balcony of her palace, gazing out over the kingdom that now felt more like a prison than a land of prosperity. The early morning light filtered through the mist, casting a soft glow over the sprawling landscape, but there was no beauty in it for her anymore. All she saw were the consequences of the decisions she had made, the families torn apart by war, the bloodshed that was to come, and the weight of the crown pressing down on her. She had always imagined ruling to be something different. She had imagined it to be about guiding her people to a brighter future. But this was nothing like what she had imagined. It was a never-ending cycle of pain, fear, and betrayal. And now, standing on the edge of everything she had fought for, Arwenna was faced with the most difficult decision of all. To fight on or to walk away. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her from her thoughts. Lord Eldrick entered, his face etched with the exhaustion of months of turmoil. He bowed slightly, but there was no warmth in his gesture. This was no longer a court of loyalty. It was a battlefield of survival. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice low, almost resigned. "The army is ready. The soldiers await your orders." Arwenna didn't turn to face him. She couldn't. She was afraid that if she did, the weight of the decision would break her entirely. She had lived through so much, seen so many people betrayed, hurt, and killed in the name of power. How could she, in good conscience, lead her people into more bloodshed? "What if I don't?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lord." Eldrick didn't respond right away, but his silence spoke volumes. He knew what the Queen was asking. He knew that the question wasn't just about war. It was about everything she had sacrificed for this crown. "Your Majesty," he said after a long pause, "if you choose not to fight, the kingdom will fall. Gaius will take the throne, and all of your efforts will have been in vain. Your family's legacy, your rule, everything will be lost." She didn't need him to tell her that. She already knew. "Then why is it so hard?" she asked, turning to face him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Why does it feel like I'm giving up something more precious than the crown itself? Why does it feel like I'm sacrificing my soul?" Eldrick met her gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something softer in his eyes. "Because the crown is not just a symbol of power. It's a symbol of sacrifice. And every ruler, no matter how strong, pays a price for it. Arwenna looked down at the crown in her hands, feeling the weight of it more than ever before. It was the symbol of her strength, her authority, and her kingdom. But it was also a reminder of the lives lost, the promises broken, and the people she had failed. She had fought for so long, but now she realized the truth. There was no victory in this war, only more suffering, more loss. Lord Eldrick, she said quietly, what if I choose to walk away? What if I surrender the throne and let someone else rule? Is it so wrong to want peace? Eldrick stiffened, clearly taken aback by her words. Your Majesty, you cannot mean this. You cannot. I do, she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I've spent so long holding on to this crown, thinking it was my duty. But what if my duty now is to stop the bloodshed? What if my duty is to protect the people, not through war, but through surrender? The room grew silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Eldrick didn't speak for a long time, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Perhaps there is wisdom in what you say, but the consequences, Your Majesty, I know, she said softly. But the greatest consequence is living with the knowledge that I led my people to ruin. She turned away from him then, gazing out at the kingdom one last time. Her heart ached with the realization that everything she had done, every choice she had made, had led her to this moment. Her mind flashed to the countless faces of the people who had cheered her on, who had believed in her. She remembered the promises she had made to them, to bring peace, to rule with justice. And yet, peace had always seemed so far away. The choice was clear, but it wasn't easy. It never would be. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Again, but this time, it wasn't Lord Eldrick. She turned to see her brother, Prince Leander, standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his once bitter eyes now coldly detached. You've made your decision, he said flatly. The protagonist nodded. Yes, I have. Leander's gaze softened ever so slightly. You know what this means. Don't. You? She nodded again. I do. The kingdom will crumble without me. But I've realized something. I don't have to be the one to carry this burden. I'm not the only person who can rule this kingdom. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for me to let go. Leander was silent for a moment before stepping into the room fully, closing the door behind him. You're right, you know. It's time for all of us to let go of the crown, of the war, of the endless cycle. He paused, then added softly, it's time to live. Arwenna met his gaze, finally seeing him for the first time as not just a prince, but a human being. The brother who had once been her closest ally, and now, perhaps, the one who would help her lead in a different way, without war, without endless sacrifice. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The following days passed in a blur of decisions, each more difficult than the last. Queen Arwenna chose to relinquish the throne, but she did not do so in weakness. She did it in the name of peace, in the name of freedom for her people. Her final act as queen was to call a council of both her allies and her enemies, and offer them a new path. One of peace, one that would end the bloodshed and heal the kingdom's wounds. It was not the ending she had imagined. It was not a victory. But as she stood before the people she had once ruled, she realized that peace, in its most fragile form, was the greatest choice she could have ever made. And, in the end, that was enough. King Alaric stood at the balcony of the grand castle, staring out at the sprawling kingdom below. The evening sun cast a warm glow on the land, but the beauty of it all seemed distant, almost irrelevant. The crown upon his head felt heavier than ever, not with the weight of gold and jewels, but with the gravity of responsibility, suspicion, and danger that now surrounded him. It had been 6 months since his father's death, and despite the lavish ceremonies, the grand processions, and the praises sung by the people, the throne was not the seat of power he had envisioned. It was a trap, a gilded cage. With every passing day, the walls of the castle seemed to close in on him, and the once ambitious young prince had become a king plagued by doubts. He turned away from the window, his gaze landing on the long table in the war room, where his closest advisers gathered. Lord Edric, the royal chancellor, spoke in low tones with Lady Mirabelle, the Queen's confidant. Alaric had known them both for years, yet now their familiarity only bred suspicion. There was something in their smiles, something in their whispers that set his nerves on edge. They were not the loyal advisers they once appeared to be. "Your Majesty," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Sir Roland, the captain of the Royal Guard, stood in the doorway. His stern, battle-hardened face was always a source of comfort, a symbol of the kingdom's strength. But even Roland's eyes, usually filled with unwavering loyalty, now held an edge of uncertainty. "Roland, what news from the border?" Alaric asked, though his voice lacked the conviction he once had. The question was routine, but the tension in the air was palpable. "The enemy gathers, Your Majesty. Scouts report movements from the east. We could be looking at a siege before the week's end," Sir Roland replied, his tone grim. Alaric nodded, his mind racing. A war with the Eastern Kingdom was inevitable. It always had been. But this time, something felt different. The sense of urgency in Roland's voice made it clear that this was not just a political game. Lives were at risk, and they would all feel the consequences of the decisions made in this room. The door opened again, and Queen Evelina entered, her presence commanding the attention of all. She was beautiful, poised, and the very image of royal grace. Yet, as Alaric watched her move towards him, his thoughts betrayed him. She too was part of the court that had grown foreign to him. They had once been a team, united in their vision for the kingdom. But lately, her eyes held a distant look, one that spoke of secrets, perhaps even lies. "Alaric," she greeted him softly, her voice laced with concern. "You look troubled. Is everything well?" Alaric hesitated before answering. "It is as well as it can be, my queen. The border war looms, and our advisors, they grow more distant every day." Evelina's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You must trust them. They have served your father faithfully." But Alaric knew that trust was a fragile thing. His father, the late King Thaddeus, had been a king of great vision and strength, but even he had been brought down by the very people he had trusted the most. The kingdom, for all its wealth, was a breeding ground for betrayal. Every noble, every advisor, every general, it seemed they all had their own agendas. No one in the court was as loyal as they appeared. "Perhaps," Alaric said, his tone cold, "but loyalty can be a fleeting thing." A moment of silence passed between them. Evelina studied him closely, her gaze searching. "You worry too much, Alaric. Not everyone is your enemy." The king knew she meant well, but her words only deepened his suspicion. He had come to understand a bitter truth. In the world of kings and queens, enemies were never far away, and sometimes they wore the same faces as allies. The feast that night was supposed to be a celebration, a gathering of nobles to discuss the kingdom's future and show strength in the face of war. But as Alaric sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his most trusted men, he couldn't shake the feeling that the very people who smiled at him were the ones who would tear him down when the moment came. The food was rich, the wine flowing freely, but Alaric barely tasted it. His eyes flicked from one guest to another, Lord Edric, Lady Mirabelle, the royal generals, each of them too comfortable in their positions, each of them too familiar with the system of power. He couldn't help but feel that beneath their smiles, they were all plotting, not just for their own gain, but for his downfall. A servant approached with a goblet of wine, presenting it to Alaric with a bow. He didn't even think twice. The wine looked fine, smelled fine, tasted fine. But the moment it touched his lips, the sharpness of it sent a chill down his spine. He put the goblet down quickly, his mind racing. It was too smooth, too deliberate. It didn't feel right. The colour of the wine, the scent. It wasn't the same as it had been moments ago. Before anyone could notice, Alaric stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "I'm feeling unwell," he announced, his voice betraying nothing but the calm facade he had been perfecting for years. "I must retire for the night." He left the feast behind, his steps quick and deliberate. As he made his way back to his chambers, the taste of the wine still lingered in his mouth, a bitter reminder that the throne was not just a symbol of power, it was a constant test of survival. The weight of the crown was heavier than ever. The days following the feast were a blur of cautious steps and hidden glances. King Alaric could feel the weight of his suspicions growing heavier with each passing moment, suffocating him in a way that had nothing to do with the responsibilities of ruling. It was the constant awareness that someone, somewhere, was working against him. Every breath he took in the castle felt like a breath taken in a room full of poison. The royal advisors had resumed their usual duties, but Alaric noticed the subtle shifts in behaviour. Lord Edric was still as smooth as ever, but there was something unnerving in the way he held himself now, something deliberate in his movements. He was always watching, always calculating, as if measuring the king's every word for signs of weakness. Lady Mirabell, on the other hand, had become more distant. Once a close confidant of Queen Evelina, she now seemed to be caught up in her own web of influence. Alaric had caught her once, whispering with Lord Edric in a secluded corner of the castle's garden. Their conversation had stopped abruptly when they saw him approaching, and the look they shared made Alaric's blood run cold. "Your Majesty," Lady Mirabell greeted him warmly when she saw him the next morning, her voice as sweet as honey. But Alaric could hear the tension beneath her words. She was hiding something. He could feel it. "Lady Mirabell," he said, offering a tight smile. "I trust you've been well." She nodded, but her eyes darted to the floor for just a moment, too brief for anyone else to notice. Alaric, however, noticed everything. "Is there something you wish to discuss?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. She hesitated, then smiled. "Again, only that I hope we can count on your support in the coming months. The kingdom is vulnerable, and your leadership will guide us through the storm." Her words were innocent enough, but to Alaric, they felt like a carefully crafted script. He had heard them too many times before. Her loyalty to him, to the kingdom, felt like a performance, not a truth. "Of course," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "I will do what is best for the kingdom." As she turned to leave, he caught the faintest smile on her lips, too quick to be genuine, too sly to be unnoticed. Alaric's instincts were sharpening. He couldn't trust his advisors, he couldn't even trust his wife, and if that weren't enough, his own mind was beginning to betray him. Every moment of stillness felt like the calm before a storm, but he couldn't tell if the storm was already inside the castle walls. That evening, Alaric called Sir Roland to his chambers. "Roland," he began, once the door was securely shut behind them, "I have suspicions about the loyalty of our council." The knight looked uneasy, but nodded. "Your Majesty, we've been through many battles together. If you sense something, I would never question your judgment." "Then you must trust me now," Alaric said, his voice lowering. "Something is amiss. I feel it in the air, and I see it in their eyes. Edric and Mirabell, they are plotting something. I can feel it." Roland looked hesitant for a moment, but his loyalty to the king was unwavering. "What should we do?" Alaric paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "We can't act recklessly. Not yet. I need proof. I need to know if we're truly surrounded by enemies or if this is all just paranoia." Roland stepped forward, his gaze firm. "I'll start gathering information, quietly." Alaric nodded. "Good, but be discreet. I cannot afford any more attention on myself. If they suspect I know something, They'll strike before I can act. As Roland left, Alaric stood by the window, staring out into the darkening sky. The stars above were distant and cold, and the chill that crept up his spine was more than the evening air. It was the reality of the crown settling in, a constant game of shadows and lies. The following days passed with the kingdom's usual bustle, but for Alaric, each interaction felt like a performance, a dance between danger and diplomacy. He could barely sleep, waking up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure if the dangers he feared were real or born from his own mind. His suspicions grew as Lord Edric seemed more evasive than ever. The Chancellor had started to avoid eye contact, and his reports were filled with inconsistencies. He would often leave meetings abruptly, as though distracted by something urgent. And when Alaric questioned him about the kingdom's defences, Edric would offer vague responses that did nothing to reassure him. One night, Alaric took matters into his own hands. He had sent Roland on a separate mission, instructing him to quietly investigate the whispers among the advisors. Alone in the castle, Alaric wandered the dimly lit halls, making his way toward the royal library. He'd noticed Edric disappearing, there frequently, but never with any clear reason. Slipping inside unnoticed, Alaric moved quietly among the towering shelves of books. He was about to give up when he heard voices from the back room. He crept closer, his heartbeat quickening. It was Edric, speaking with someone in low tones. "The king is too cautious. He will never see the truth," Edric whispered. "Then we make him see it," a second voice replied, one that was unmistakably Lady Mirabel's. "The poison is already prepared. The time will come soon." Alaric's blood ran cold. Poison. They had been plotting his death all along. His mind raced. The Queen, his wife, was involved. They were using him as a pawn, and they had planned to kill him before he could act against them. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier. He had been right all along. The kingdom was full of enemies, but the deadliest ones were those closest to him. He had to act now. Alaric's heart raced as the words of his betrayers echoed in his ears. The realization that his closest allies were plotting his death left him cold. But he knew one thing above all. If he did not act swiftly, the kingdom would slip from his grasp, and he would never live to see it fall. Poison. They had been poisoning him slowly with every meal, every drink. The very wine that had burned his throat that night. It had been meant for him. The king's hands trembled as he retraced his steps through the castle halls, his mind calculating every possible move. His life was no longer in his hands. He could trust no one, not even those he had considered family. His first instinct was to confront them, but something inside him held back. They would expect that. If he revealed he knew, it would be the final sign that he was weak, vulnerable. No, he had to outwit them, stay one step ahead. A king who showed his hand too soon was a king who was already defeated. The decision was made. Alaric had to root out the traitors, but to do so, he needed to act in the shadows, just like them. He couldn't expose himself until he had the upper hand. He summoned his most trusted knight, Sir Roland, to his chambers in the dead of night. The knight's eyes were sharp, full of suspicion, as if he knew the king had uncovered something. Dark, something dangerous. "Your Majesty, what is it?" Roland asked, his voice low and steady, though there was a tension in his posture that betrayed his calm demeanour. "Sit, Roland," Alaric ordered, his voice weary yet firm. "I've uncovered something that threatens not just my life, but the very future of this kingdom." Roland took a seat, his gaze unwavering. He had never seen the king so serious, so burdened. "What have you learned?" "The court, Edric, Mirabel, they've been plotting against me." Alaric's voice was cold. "They've been poisoning me, slowly, with each meal, each drink. But now, they plan to kill me outright, to take the throne. They've been working together, waiting for the right moment." Roland's eyes darkened, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword at his side. We must act immediately, Your Majesty. Confront them. No, Alaric replied, shaking his head. If I reveal what I know, they'll strike before I can do anything. They have too many allies, too many connections. I need to gather more proof, solid evidence that no one can deny. Roland nodded slowly, his expression grim. Then what would you have me do? I need you to gather information, quietly. Watch their movements, follow them, listen to their conversations. If they plan to kill me, I need to know when, where, and how. I cannot allow them to take the throne without a fight. Roland's voice was filled with resolve. It will be done, Your Majesty. We will expose their treachery. The king stood and walked to the window, staring out at the vast, sprawling kingdom. His thoughts raced as he wondered how many others in the court were involved in the plot. Who could he trust? How many of them had already chosen sides? The next few days passed in a blur of secret meetings and covert actions. Alaric did his best to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He held court, spoke with advisors, and made decisions as though nothing had changed. But inside, he was a different man. Every moment was filled with the weight of his growing knowledge, the realization that those around him, those he once thought he could rely on, had already decided his fate. One evening, a servant entered his chambers with a message. Alaric read it quickly, his eyes narrowing. It was from Sir Roland. I've gathered the information you requested. Meet me in the garden after dusk. Do not bring anyone with you. The king's pulse quickened. Roland had something important. As night fell, Alaric made his way to the garden, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the stone path. He reached the meeting spot, where Roland stood, waiting in the dark. The knight's face was grim, and his hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Speak quickly, Roland, Alaric demanded. What have you learned? Roland hesitated, then spoke in a low voice, as if the very words could betray them. I've been following Edric and Mirabelle. They've been meeting regularly, secretly. The last meeting I witnessed was in the old cellar beneath the castle. They were discussing the poisoning plan in detail, and they mentioned something else. They said they had arranged for his death to be quick and unnoticed. They've already prepared the chalice. Alaric felt the blood drain from his face. The chalice. The one that would be used in the next royal feast. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like a blow to the chest. We have no time, Roland continued. They plan to strike within the next few days. The feast, perhaps. You'll be vulnerable then. Alaric clenched his fists, his mind racing. I cannot let them win. I must take control before they take my life. But I need to know one thing. Who else is involved? Who else can I trust? Roland looked uncertain. I'm not sure, Your Majesty, but there's a way to find out. If we can intercept their next meeting, we might learn everything. The king thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the shadows around them. It was dangerous, perhaps the most dangerous thing he could do, but it was his only option. Prepare yourself, Alaric said, his voice hardening with resolve. We move tonight. We expose them for who they truly are. The night was thick with tension as Alaric and Sir Roland made their way through the shadowed halls of the castle. Every creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed louder than it should be, and every breath felt like a sharp whisper that could betray their presence. Their destination was the old cellar beneath the castle, a place long forgotten by most but known to a select few, a place where secrets were hidden and where those who sought power often plotted in the dark. As they neared the cellar's entrance, Alaric's mind raced. The plan was simple. Confront Edric and Mirabelle, catch them in the act, and expose their treachery. But nothing was ever as simple as it seemed in the world of kings and courtiers. The risks were enormous. If they were caught, the consequences would be swift and deadly. Alaric's hand gripped the hilt of his sword, the cool steel grounding him in the moment. His kingdom, his life, everything was at stake. Stay close, he whispered to Roland. If we're going in, we go in quietly. The knight nodded, drawing his sword in silence. They descended into the cellar, the air growing colder with each step. The stone walls seemed to close in on them, and the darkness swallowed their every move. They finally reached the heavy wooden door that led into the cellar's inner chamber. Alaric's hand paused on the door, and he motioned for Roland to stay behind him. Slowly, cautiously, he turned the handle, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. What he saw took him by surprise. It wasn't just Edric and Mirabel. There were others. More faces, more figures gathered in the dim light. Alaric could barely make out their silhouettes, but their presence was enough to make his blood run cold. Lord Edric stood at the centre, speaking in hushed tones, his voice sharp and commanding. "The time is nearly here. Once we've removed Alaric, we'll be free to rule as we see fit. The throne will be ours to claim." Mirabel was by his side, nodding. "But we must act swiftly. His paranoia has grown, and if he senses we are close, everything could fall apart." Alaric's fists clenched as he listened, the sting of betrayal deeper than any sword wound. These were the people he had trusted, the ones who swore loyalty to him, to the crown. And now they were plotting to kill him and usurp everything he had built. But there was more. A familiar face emerged from the shadows, one Alaric had not expected to see. It was Lady Evelina, his queen. The king's heart skipped a beat as she stepped forward, her eyes dark with malice. "You speak of usurpation," she said, her voice low. "But do you think we can truly rule without dealing with the commoners? They will never accept a change in leadership without bloodshed." Edric smiled, a wicked grin that made Alaric's skin crawl. "We'll handle them when the time comes, Evelina. But first, we need to ensure Alaric's end. Once he's gone, the throne will be ours. His bloodline will be wiped out, and will be untouchable." Alaric felt the ground beneath him shift, the air suddenly thick with the weight of their words. His queen, the woman he had shared his bed with, the woman he had loved, was as guilty as the rest. She was no longer the woman he had married. She was a serpent, her loyalty a lie. "We'll do it tomorrow," Mirabel said, her voice betraying the excitement that twisted in her stomach. "At the feast, we'll use the poisoned chalice and frame it as an accident. A natural death." Alaric's mind raced. He had to stop them. He couldn't let them carry out their plans. But he also knew that the time to act was now, or else. The conspiracy would be buried along with him. He motioned for Roland to move into position. The knight nodded silently, preparing for the confrontation. But Alaric had one final question, one that had been gnawing at him since the beginning. "Why?" Alaric's voice cut through the silence, his tone cold, calculated. The conspirators froze, their eyes darting toward the doorway. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Edric's voice broke the stillness, mocking. "Why?" Edric chuckled darkly. "Because you're weak, Alaric. You're a king of the past. You sit on your throne, surrounded by walls of delusion, thinking that loyalty is something that can be trusted. But we all know that power belongs to those who take it. And you're too soft, too honorable. Your reign has been a slow march to your own demise." The words hit harder than any blade. Alaric's mind swirled with rage, but he contained it. He couldn't let them see how much their betrayal affected him. He stepped into the room, his voice cutting through the darkness. "You're wrong. You think power is something you take. You've forgotten that power is something you earn. And I'll fight to the death to keep it." Edric's smirk faltered, and Mirabel stepped back. But it was Evelina who looked most shaken. She stared at Alaric with wide eyes, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "Alaric, you don't understand. We did this for you, for us, for the future. The kingdom needs more than your ideals." Alaric shook his head. "You never understood. It was never about ideals. It was about trust. And you betrayed me." Roland stepped forward, his sword drawn. "It's over. You've been caught." The room erupted into chaos as the conspirators tried to flee, but Alaric and Roland were too quick. They had them cornered, their plans undone in an instant. "I should have known," Alaric said, his voice filled with disgust. "The greatest enemy I've ever faced wasn't outside the castle walls. It was right here, in my own court. The chaos in the cellar was deafening. The conspirators, cornered by the king and Sir Roland, moved like trapped animals, their faces twisted with fear and desperation. Alaric's pulse was racing, but he kept his voice steady, his words filled with the weight of finality. "You thought you could take everything from me," Alaric said coldly, his eyes scanning the faces of the traitors. "But in the end, you've lost more than you ever imagined." Edric, the once loyal chancellor, stood trembling, his earlier arrogance gone. "Please, your majesty, listen to reason. We only wanted what was best for the kingdom." "The kingdom doesn't need a king like you," Alaric spat, his gaze hardening. "It needs someone who values loyalty over power, justice over greed." Behind him, Roland tightened his grip on his sword, ever watchful, ready to strike should anyone make a move. But there was no more need for violence. Not yet. The truth had already been laid bare. The king had caught them in their web of lies, and now there would be no escape. Lady Evelina, standing to the side, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of guilt and defiance. Her eyes met Alaric's, and for a brief moment, it felt like the past was still there, like they could go back to what they once had. But it was too late. "You were supposed to be my partner," Alaric said, his voice breaking through the cold facade he had built around himself. "You were supposed to be the one I trusted the most. But now, I see that you were just another piece in this game of betrayal." Evelina's lips trembled. "Alaric, She took a step toward him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and regret. "I did it for us, for the future of the kingdom. You were weak. You couldn't see that." "I saw more than you think," Alaric replied bitterly. "I saw you, and I saw them. I saw the lies you told me, the way you manipulated me, the way you slowly poisoned my trust." He took a step closer, his chest tight with the weight of the moment. "You didn't do this for the kingdom. You did it for yourself. And that's what makes it unforgivable." Silence fell over the room. Evelina's gaze shifted from Alaric to the others, then back to him. The queen seemed to shrink under the weight of his words, as if every inch of her once proud figure had been stripped away. "Alaric, please," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far. You should have thought of that before." The king cut her off, his tone hardening. "Before you plotted to end my life, before you chose to betray the very man who stood beside you." Lady Mirabelle, who had been standing silently to the side, now spoke up, her voice laced with venom. "You always were a fool, Alaric. You thought you could rule with honor, but honor won't save you when the kingdom burns. It won't stop the people from turning on you. It never has." The words stung, but Alaric held his ground. "Perhaps honor won't stop the kingdom from falling apart, but it will stop me from becoming like you. Power without principle is nothing but poison, and I won't drink from that cup." He turned to Sir Roland. "Take them to the dungeons. Let them rot with their lies." As Roland moved to carry out the king's orders, Alaric's gaze flickered one last time to Evelina. She stood motionless, her face a mixture of anguish and defeat. For a fleeting moment, Alaric thought he saw a flicker of the woman he had once loved, but it was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the betrayal. She was no longer his queen. She was no longer his partner. She had chosen power over loyalty, and in the end, that was a choice that could not be undone. As the traitors were led away, Alaric stood in the cellar alone, the weight of the crown pressing down on him once more. He had saved his kingdom from the brink of destruction, but at a terrible cost. He had lost the people he loved, the trust he had fought for, and the vision of a future that once seemed so clear. The kingdom would continue, but it would never be the same. The silence of the cellar felt suffocating now, the echoes of betrayal and loss lingering in the air. Alaric knew that his path forward would be fraught with challenges. There would always be enemies, always those who sought to take what he had. But he had learned one valuable lesson through it all. The crown did not just symbolize power, it symbolized sacrifice. And in this world of betrayal and bloodshed, the true test of a king was not just surviving the darkness, but holding on to whatever shred of honor he could in the process. He would rebuild the kingdom, but it would never be the same. He would never be the same. And with that, the story comes to a close. Alaric has emerged victorious, but not without paying a heavy price. His kingdom is saved, but at the cost of everything he once held dear. The throne room was quiet, save for the faint rustle of silk against marble. Queen Alara stood before her advisors, her regal cloak flowing behind her like the dark storm clouds that always seemed to hover over her kingdom. It was as though fate itself had woven a heavy tapestry of responsibility and expectation around her shoulders, one she could never fully shrug off. At 23, she was the youngest monarch in the kingdom's history. She had inherited the throne from her late father, whose sudden death had left Alara to reign in a world full of shifting allegiances, unstable alliances, and growing unrest. The weight of her crown, polished and heavy, felt as though it might crush her at any moment. And yet, despite the pain, she carried it with a dignity that was expected of her. Her marriage to Prince Alistair had been arranged long before she ascended to the throne. It was a political maneuver, nothing more than a union of convenience designed to seal an alliance with the neighbouring kingdom of Arcadia. But to Alara, it had never felt like a union at all. There were no words of affection, no promises of a future built together. Instead, she had stood before the altar, a silent participant in a ceremony that marked the beginning of her reign and the end of any hope for a personal life of her own. Her heart sank as she watched the procession of nobles file past her. They smiled, they nodded, but they saw her as nothing more than a figurehead, a queen in title, but not in power. Beneath her poised exterior, Alara felt the hollow ache of her own helplessness. She longed to change something, to shape her kingdom into a place of peace. But every attempt at change felt like a rebellion against the very foundation of the monarchy. She glanced across the room, her gaze meeting that of her husband. Prince Alistair stood tall beside the grand throne, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. To the people, they were the epitome of a royal couple, united, strong, and unyielding. But Alara knew better. They were two strangers forced into a life they hadn't chosen. Their marriage was a contract, a bargain. They both understood that. Yet as their eyes met, Alara saw a flicker of something beyond the icy facade. It was a fleeting moment, but she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps, in his heart, Alistair felt the same crushing weight of this life. Did he also yearn for freedom? Did he, too, feel the walls closing in? Before she could contemplate further, an advisor approached with urgent news. "Your Majesty, there has been word from the northern border. We suspect an invasion is imminent." The words hit Alara like a thunderclap. The calm of the hall shattered in an instant, and she was thrust into the heart of a nightmare. Her kingdom was on the brink of war, the kingdom she had inherited. A fragile thing, a fragile peace. "Do we have confirmation?" Alara asked, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "No, Your Majesty, but our scouts report unusual movements along the border. We believe it is a matter of days before they make their move." Her mind raced. She had been trained to rule, but no amount of royal etiquette could prepare her for war. Her father had been the strategist, the diplomat, the warrior king. Alara. She had never picked up a sword. She had never had to make decisions that could lead to the lives of thousands being altered forever. Her role had always been ceremonial, a queen in name only, but now she was the monarch. It was her responsibility to protect her people. Alara nodded solemnly, the realization of her power and her vulnerability becoming painfully clear. "I want a full report on the situation within the hour," she instructed, her voice cold and resolute. "Alert the generals. We prepare for war." As the advisor rushed off to deliver her command, Ilara's mind spun. She had always known her reign would not be easy, but nothing could have prepared her for the rush of decisions that now lay at her feet. Every move she made, every word she spoke, could tip the scales of history. The fate of her kingdom was in her hands, and the burden felt unbearable. "Your Majesty," a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Lady Morgana, one of Ilara's closest confidants, who had been with her since childhood. The lady's warm brown eyes seemed to radiate concern as she approached. "Is everything well?" "Everything is fine," Ilara lied, offering a thin smile. Lady Morgana raised an eyebrow but said nothing, choosing instead to place a hand on the Queen's shoulder. Ilara appreciated the gesture, though she knew her friend could see through her facade. "You know you don't have to do this alone," Morgana murmured, her voice gentle but firm. "You have allies. You have us." But Ilara only shook her head. There were no true allies in this life, not in this game of politics and power. She was a queen, a symbol of strength for the kingdom. Yet, within the palace walls, she felt like a ghost, caught in the currents of a world that was constantly shifting beneath her. As the clock ticked on, Ilara found herself growing restless. The weight of the crown was unbearable. The decisions ahead were monumental. The kingdom, her marriage, and even her own future were all tied to this one day. And yet, no matter what she did, no matter what choices she made, she knew that the chaos was only beginning. Tomorrow, she thought, everything could change, and she would have to face the consequences of the choices she made today. The grand hall was adorned with golden banners, and the air buzzed with anticipation as the guests took their places. Queen Ilara stood at the top of the grand staircase, staring down at the opulent scene before her. The flowers had been carefully arranged, the finest tapestries draped over the walls, and the musicians played a soft, enchanting melody that filled the space with an almost ethereal ambience. This was supposed to be a celebration, a union of two kingdoms, an event that would mark a new era for her people. But to Ilara, it felt like a masquerade. Her eyes wandered to the raised platform at the far end of the hall, where Prince Alistair stood, his back straight, his posture as flawless as ever. He appeared every bit the perfect prince, handsome, composed, the epitome of royal dignity. His deep blue robe shimmered in the light, matching the colour of his kingdom's banner. To the court and the guests, he was the ideal husband. To Ilara, he was little more than a distant ally, someone she had never chosen, someone whose touch felt foreign. This was not love. This was duty. This was survival. The tension in her chest tightened as her gaze met Alistair's. His eyes flickered toward her, but there was no warmth, no recognition of the bond they were supposed to share. Just a cool indifference that mirrored her own feelings. They had been forced together by politics, two kingdoms bound in marriage to preserve peace. But what about her? What about the person she was before the crown? Did anyone ever wonder about her desires, her dreams? She was only a figurehead, a piece in a larger game. A soft tug at her sleeve pulled her from her thoughts. It was Lady Morgana again, her constant companion and confidant. "Your Majesty," Morgana whispered, her voice full of concern. "Are you all right?" Ilara gave a small nod, though the weight of her thoughts made it hard to find her voice. She didn't want to say that the wedding felt like a farce, that it was all a lie they were living for the sake of appearances. It would have been too much for Morgana to understand. "I'm fine," Ilara replied, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the truth. She wasn't fine. She wasn't sure when she had stopped feeling anything at all. As the ceremony began, Ilara's feet felt as though they were made of stone, dragging her forward despite her reluctance. The guests all stood, their faces filled with eager anticipation. The heavy silence in the room was pierced only by the soft sound of footsteps echoing across the marble floor. The officiant began to speak, his voice rising and falling in a formal cadence that made Ilara feel like she was standing in the middle of an elaborate play she had no interest in performing. She glanced up at Alistair once more. His expression was unreadable, but the faintest hint of tension lingered in his jaw. Was he as trapped in this arrangement as she was? The thought was fleeting, and Alara quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't a time for such sentiments. She had to focus on what was at stake, on the kingdom. The moment the vows were exchanged, it was over. There was no fanfare, no jubilant celebration, only the dull realization that her life had taken a different path than the one she had ever hoped for. A queen in name, but not in spirit. A wife in duty, but never in heart. As the guests congratulated the royal couple, Alara barely noticed their words. Her mind was elsewhere, on the letters she had received just the day before. Whispers of an invasion, murmurs of unrest within the ranks of her kingdom. But nothing could prepare her for what she would hear next. A shout echoed from the rear of the hall, interrupting the parade of well-wishers. A guard rushed toward the platform, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Your Majesty," he gasped, his voice shaking. "There's been a report. We've sighted movement along the northern border. It appears that enemy forces are massing." The sigh, room fell silent. Alara's stomach twisted, the weight of the news sinking in. Her hand trembled as she reached for Alistair's arm, the only thing that grounded her in that moment of chaos. He looked down at her, his face unreadable, and then nodded toward the guards. "Prepare the army," Alistair ordered coldly. "Send word to the generals. The Queen and I will attend to this matter immediately." Alara nodded, but inside she felt a coldness settle over her. Was this really happening? Was the kingdom on the brink of war, just as she had feared? "Excuse me, Your Majesty," another voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Lord Alaric, one of the kingdom's most trusted military advisors. He stood near the back of the hall, his face tense. "We have a matter of great importance. A spy was captured near the border. He claims to have information about the enemy's plans. We must act quickly." Alara nodded, trying to compose herself. It seemed as though everything had come to a head. Her first day as queen, her wedding day, was already tainted by political scheming, threats, and the looming shadow of war. She had hoped for peace, for stability, but it was clear that the kingdom would never be the same again. Turning to Alistair, Alara could see the same storm brewing in his eyes. This was not the royal life they had dreamed of. This was a game of survival, a game neither of them had chosen, but were now forced to play. The truth hit Alara like a jolt of lightning. She wasn't just a figurehead in a royal court. She was the queen. And whether she was ready or not, the kingdom was hers to defend. The corridors of the castle were alive with activity, the usual calm replaced by the frantic pace of preparations. Queen Alara, still in her wedding gown, now stood in a war room, her hands pressed flat against the cold stone table. Her head throbbed from the onslaught of decisions. The news of the impending invasion had shattered the thin illusion of normalcy she had clung to, and now she was expected to lead. Her advisors gathered around her, military commanders, nobles, and generals, each offering advice, each speaking over the other in their urgency to act. Alara barely heard them. Her mind was consumed with the enormity of what lay ahead. They needed to prepare. They needed to act. But where did she fit in this world of strategy and war? "Your Majesty," General Hadrian said, his voice deep and commanding, "the enemy has been spotted less than a day's march from our northern borders. They are well equipped and seem prepared for a siege. Our army is ready, but we'll need your orders to mobilize." Her chest tightened. I don't know what to order. My father, he was the one who handled this. He was the one who led our people." She glanced up at the stern faces of her commanders, each expecting her to lead them. But Alara felt as though she were drowning in their expectations. A queen was not supposed to waver, to question. But how could she make decisions when everything felt like a blur, and every choice could mean the lives of her people? "Your Majesty," Alistair's voice broke through her thoughts, bringing her back to the present. He stood at her side now, his brow furrowed, but his demeanor was cool, as always. "We have no choice. If we delay, the enemy will be upon us. You must make your decision now." He was right. They were running out of time. Elara took a deep breath and forced herself to stand tall. She had to do this for the kingdom, for the people who depended on her. Even if she didn't know the first thing about warfare, even if she had no experience leading an army, she had to act. "Begin preparations," she said, her voice steady despite the cold fear pooling in her stomach. "Mobilize the troops and fortify the northern walls. We'll hold them at the border and send word to the neighboring kingdoms. We may need reinforcements." A murmur of approval rippled through the room, but Elara felt no relief. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, and her hands were shaking as she clutched the edge of the table. Her eyes flickered to Alistair, who met her gaze with an unreadable expression. Was he proud of her decision, or was he silently judging her? His presence, though comforting, only seemed to highlight the chasm between them. They were bound by duty, not by love. And as much as Elara longed for the kind of partnership that her marriage should have provided, she knew it would never come. They were two people united by politics, not by shared ideals. "We'll need to meet with the Council of War," General Hadrian continued, breaking the silence that had descended. "We must decide on the tactical approach to the battle, and you'll need to provide your input." Elara nodded. She didn't know what kind of input she was expected to give, but she would do her best. She was the queen, and in this moment, that was all that mattered. The meeting stretched on for hours, with Elara listening as the commanders debated the best course of action. They spoke of tactics she could barely understand: flanks, defenses, reinforcements. Every word made her feel smaller and more inadequate, but she held her ground, nodding when necessary, making decisions when forced to. Her advisors respected her authority, but their deference only made her feel more isolated. She had the power to change the course of history, but she didn't have the experience to know if the decisions she was making were the right ones. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the kingdom, Elara stood at the window, staring out at the vast lands beyond the castle walls. The city of Ravencross, once full of life, was now a fortress, preparing for an enemy they hadn't yet seen, but knew was coming. It felt like a dream, one she couldn't wake from. Alistair approached her quietly, his footsteps soft on the stone floor. "You did well today," he said, his voice gentle for the first time since their wedding. "You held your own in the council. You showed strength when it mattered." She turned to face him, her heart heavy. "Strength?" She laughed bitterly, her voice hollow. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm losing control of everything. My marriage, my kingdom, my life. It's all falling apart." Alistair studied her for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. "You're not losing control, Elara. You're holding it together. I see it. This kingdom, it needs you now more than ever, and I'm here to help you." The words were reassuring, but Elara felt no comfort. What good were words when the weight of the world pressed down on her every second? She needed action, not empty promises. "You don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You don't know what it's like to carry all of this, to be the one who has to make decisions that will decide the fate of everyone you care about. I can't do this alone, Alistair. I can't do this at all." He reached for her hand, a gesture that felt foreign between them. "You're not alone," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "We're in this together, whether you believe it or not." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Elara almost believed him, but the truth was, she was the queen, she was alone, and in the end, no one else could make the decisions that would define her reign. As night fell over Ravencross, the looming threat of war hung over them all. The kingdom was preparing for battle, but Elara knew that the true war had already begun. Not on the battlefield, but within herself. The quiet hum of the palace at night was always a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the day. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the walls as Queen Alara sat in her private chambers, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of a letter she had just received. The words on the page were chilling, but it wasn't the foreign threats of invasion that weighed on her mind tonight. It was something far more insidious, something much closer to home, an assassination plot. Her pulse quickened as she reread the words. The message, delivered by an anonymous source, was clear. Someone within the castle, someone trusted, was plotting to take her life. The realization sent a cold shiver through her spine, as though the very air around her had turned hostile. She looked up as the door to her chambers creaked open. Lady Morgana entered, her face drawn and tired, but her expression turned sharp when she saw Alara's tense posture. "Alara, what is it? What's wrong?" Morgana asked, her voice urgent, though the Queen could see the worry in her eyes. Alara hesitated for a moment, her thoughts swirling. How could she trust anyone in a kingdom so fractured? But Morgana had been her friend since childhood, and in that moment, she felt an overwhelming need to confide in someone. Anyone. "It's not the war," Alara said, her voice shaking slightly. "There's been a plot against me. Someone wants me dead, Morgana. Someone inside the castle." Morgana's eyes widened, and she took a step forward, her hand resting on the Queen's shoulder. "Are you sure? How do you know this?" Alara placed the letter on the table, her fingers still trembling as she pushed it toward Morgana. "It was delivered to me in secret, unsigned, but the message is clear. They're plotting against me." Morgana read the letter quickly, her brow furrowing with concern. "This is serious. Whoever is behind this must be close. You're right to be worried." Alara stood up abruptly, pacing the room as her mind raced. But who? Who could want me dead, and why? There are so many factions within the court. Nobles, military leaders, advisors. It could be anyone. Morgana's gaze was steady as she placed the letter back on the table. "We have to find out who's behind this, Alara. But we must tread carefully. If there's someone in the castle conspiring against you, we can't let them know that you've discovered their plot." Alara paused, her chest tightening. "I don't have time for this, Morgana. The kingdom is on the brink of war, and now I have to worry about who wants to kill me. I can't." "You don't have a choice," Morgana interrupted, her tone sharp. "You are the Queen, Alara. You have to survive this. If you don't, everything you've worked for, everything your father built, it will all fall apart." The weight of those words hit Alara like a sledgehammer. She had never felt more alone in her life, caught in the snare of duty and deception. How had it come to this? How had she gone from a young woman with dreams of ruling her people with compassion to a target in a deadly game of political intrigue? As if on cue, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Your Majesty," a voice called from the other side. "It's Lord Alaric. May I enter?" Alara turned to Morgana, her eyes filled with questions. "Do you think we can trust him?" Morgana considered the question for a long moment. "He's loyal, I believe, but we must be cautious. There are few we can trust completely." Alara nodded and called for the door to be opened. Lord Alaric entered, his face as calm as ever, but there was a tension in his eyes that Alara hadn't noticed before. "Your Majesty," he said with a low bow. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but there is a matter of great importance we must discuss. I have received troubling reports regarding the conspiracy you've uncovered." Alara's breath caught in her throat. "You know?" Lord Alaric nodded, stepping closer. "I've known for a while, Your Majesty. There have been whispers, rumours, strange occurrences. I feared something like this might happen, which is why I've been keeping an eye on the more suspicious figures in the castle." Alara's mind raced. Who? Who can we trust?" "The answer isn't simple," Alaric replied, his voice grave. "The conspiracy goes deep. I've managed to uncover one of the main conspirators, but I dare not say their name just yet. It's too dangerous. We need to approach this carefully, Alara. The people you think you can trust may not be who they seem. Morgana's face grew pale. Then what do? We make a plan, Alaric said, his voice steady. We act quickly but quietly. First, we must secure the royal guard. I'll make sure they remain loyal to you, and we'll put some of your most trusted guards in key positions. Second, we gather more information. We can't act on incomplete knowledge, or it could all backfire. Ilara's mind whirled. And what if they find out before we're ready? What if they make their move first? We'll be ready for them, Alaric replied, his tone unwavering. We'll be ready. The weight of his words sank into her like stone. The reality was clear now. The kingdom wasn't just at war with an external enemy. It was fighting a civil war of lies and betrayal. And the worst part was that the enemy could be anyone. For the first time in her life, Ilara felt truly vulnerable. She was no longer just a queen on the battlefield. She was a queen surrounded by enemies, forced to play a game she never asked to be a part of. Start making preparations, Ilara said, her voice filled with resolve. We can't let them destroy everything. Alaric bowed deeply. As you wish, Your Majesty. We will do everything we can to protect you. As he left the room, Ilara felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She didn't know who would betray her. She didn't know how this game would end, but one thing was certain. She would fight to the bitter end. The sun had barely begun to rise over Ravencross, casting long slanted rays across the stone walls of the castle. Queen Ilara stood at the window, staring out at the horizon, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. The air outside was crisp, the city slowly coming to life, but inside the castle, chaos reigned. The conspiracy was no longer a shadow in the background. It was at the forefront of her every decision, every interaction. She couldn't trust anyone, not fully. Every noble, every servant, every advisor had become a suspect. Even Alistair, the man she had once hoped would be her partner in all this, had become a distant figure. Their marriage, built on politics, was now a prison of its own. Ilara turned, away from the window, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. She didn't recognize the woman she had become. The naive girl who had once dreamed of peace and unity was gone, replaced by a queen who was forced to fight not just for her kingdom, but for her life. The war at the northern border was raging. Her military had held the line, but the enemy was relentless. The battle was far from over, and her people were suffering. The whispers of the assassination plot still echoed in her mind, but there was no time to dwell on them. There was a kingdom to protect, a people to save. Ilara, a voice called softly from the doorway. It was Lady Morgana, her face pale with concern. You've been standing here for hours. You need to rest. Ilara didn't answer at first. Rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. I can't. There's too much at stake. The army needs me. The kingdom needs me. Morgana stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Ilara's shoulder. And what about you? What do you need? This weight you're carrying. It's too much for anyone to bear alone. The words stung. Ilara had known that Morgana was right, but the truth was too hard to admit. She had tried to carry everything, the kingdom, the marriage, the expectations, and it was breaking her. She had never asked for any of this, yet now it felt like there was no way out. I can't stop now, Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. If I do, everything will fall apart. Morgana shook her head. You're only human, Ilara. Even queens have limits. Ilara finally met her friend's gaze, a flicker of vulnerability passing through her eyes. What if I fail? What if all of it is for nothing? Morgana's expression softened. You won't fail, but you can't keep going like this. You need allies, Ilara. You need someone to help carry the burden. Ilara took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had been trying so hard to do it all on her own, to prove that she could lead without anyone's help. But Morgana was right. The burden of leadership of this life was too much for one person. She had to trust others. She had to let them in. And yet, even as she thought this, she knew that there were few she could trust. The conspiracy, the war, the fractured alliances, it had all poisoned her world. The more she tried to protect the kingdom, the more she felt herself slipping away. "There's no one I can trust completely," Alara said quietly. "Not even Alistair." Morgana's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I've heard whispers," Alara confessed, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I've seen the way he acts, the way he distances himself. He's not the man I thought he was." Morgana placed a hand on her arm, steadying her. "You're not alone in this, Alara. Not everyone is out to get you." "I don't know anymore," Alara replied, her voice breaking. "I don't know who to trust." There was a long silence before Morgana spoke again. "You have to trust yourself. You've already done so much, kept your kingdom intact, led your people through a war. But this is about more than just the kingdom. It's about you, Alara. It's about finding peace in your heart." Alara's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps approaching. Alistair entered the room, his expression grim but determined. "Alara," he said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was so much unsaid between them, so many things left unspoken. The assassination plot, the war, their fractured marriage. It had all pushed them further apart. But now, it was time for them to face the truth. "I don't have much time," Alara said, her voice hoarse. "We need to make decisions, Alara," Alistair replied, his tone clipped. "The enemy is getting closer. We need to act, and we need to act now." She felt a knot form in her stomach. This was it. The moment when everything would change. She was no longer just the queen. She was the woman who would decide the fate of her kingdom, of her people, and perhaps even of her marriage. "I know," she said quietly. "But I'm not sure I can do it alone anymore." Alistair's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "You don't have to. I'm here." For the first time in a long while, Alara wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that, together, they could weather the storm. But she knew the truth, the bitter truth she had been running from. Power came at a price, and sometimes that price was too high to pay. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice low. "I'll prove it to you. We'll fight this together. You won't have to carry the weight alone." But Alara knew better than to believe in easy promises. The kingdom, the war, the plot against her life, it was all too much. And in the end, no matter what decisions she made, no matter who she trusted, one thing remained certain. The price of power was steep, and there was no way to escape it. The kingdom's fate, and hers, would be decided not by strength or resolve, but by the sacrifices she was willing to make. Dr. Richard Wells was used to the dusty confines of university libraries, hours spent poring over ancient texts, analyzing the lives of kings and queens. In his quiet office, surrounded by the hum of modernity, he often imagined what it would be like to experience the royal life firsthand. The pomp, the power, the unquestioned authority. Surely it was a life of leisure and luxury, or so he thought. One morning, as Richard adjusted his glasses and sifted through yet another tattered manuscript detailing the reign of a medieval monarch, he received an unexpected invitation. An envelope with no return address, simply a wax seal embossed with a crown, was slipped under his office door. Intrigued and a little skeptical, Richard opened it, reading the single line written inside. "Experience the life of a king. The opportunity of a lifetime awaits you." The note was signed by someone named Edmund Calloway, a name Richard had never heard of. The letter contained only a cryptic address and a promise of something extraordinary. His curiosity piqued. Richard decided to investigate. Arriving at the address, a dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of town, Richard felt uneasy. The house seemed out of place, as if it belonged in another time entirely. Inside, he was greeted by a peculiar man, dressed in a long tattered robe. Edmund Calloway, the man introduced himself as, was eccentric and wild-eyed, with an air of mystery about him. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling over one another in a rush. "Dr. Wells, I've been following your work. You've spent your life studying kings and queens. But what would you say if I told you that you could be one for a day? Not just any king, mind you, but a medieval king, living, breathing, ruling, just as they did centuries ago." Richard was taken aback. "You can't be serious," he replied. But Calloway insisted. "I'm quite serious. Using technology that combines history and time travel, I can transport you to the past. You'll experience the world of royalty firsthand, beyond the pages of your books. It's an opportunity no historian has ever had." Richard, intrigued and skeptical, hesitated for only a moment. His whole life had been spent studying kings from a distance. This was the ultimate chance to experience the very life he had only ever read about. The allure of stepping into history was too strong to resist. "You'll live for one full day as King Aldrich, ruler of the Kingdom of Arcadia. But remember, once you're in, Calloway warned, his grin widening. Richard nodded, eager to begin. The machine whirred to life, and in an instant, the world around him shifted. He felt a disorienting spin of colors, a rush of cold air, and then, just as quickly, everything stopped. Richard stumbled, finding himself standing in a massive stone hall, surrounded by flickering torchlight. He looked down at his clothes, rich velvet, embroidered with gold thread. His fingers brushed against a heavy crown resting on his head. It was real. He was King Aldrich. And the weight of the crown was not just symbolic, it was literal. He felt a wave of panic surge through him. Calloway's voice echoed in his mind. "You're in the 12th century now, Richard. Welcome to the life of a king." Richard was about to respond when a group of servants and royal advisors entered the room, bowing before him. His first instinct was to tell them to rise, but the words stuck in his throat. They awaited his commands. This was real. He wasn't just reading about kingship. He was living it. The enormity of the situation hit him. What was expected of him? What did he have to do? He was utterly unprepared. One of the advisors, an older man with a long greying beard, spoke first. "Your Majesty, there are urgent matters to discuss. The kingdom's treasury is in disarray, and the peasants are protesting in the southern region." Richard blinked, trying to focus on the gravity of the situation. This wasn't the idyllic royal life he'd imagined. His mind raced as the advisors began speaking faster, throwing out technical terms he didn't understand. A war was brewing, the rebels were gaining strength, and there were urgent decisions to be made about the kingdom's resources. He tried to speak with authority, but his voice cracked under the pressure. Let's deal with the treasury first, I suppose." The advisors exchanged glances, clearly unsure of his competence. Richard felt the weight of the crown grow heavier with each passing second. This was not going to be as easy as he had imagined. The court was full of eyes, all watching him, waiting for him to lead. His thoughts scrambled for a coherent response, but nothing came to mind. The reality of what it meant to rule a kingdom was sinking in. It wasn't about luxury or grand feasts. It was about constant problems, constant pressure, and never having a moment's peace. "Your Majesty, there is also the matter of the upcoming feast with the neighbouring kingdom. It would be prudent to finalise the guest list," another advisor chimed in. Feasts. Richard had read about them in history books, lavish banquets where kings and queens mingled with the finest nobles. But this was just another layer of responsibility that added to the overwhelming weight of leadership. He could hardly focus on one problem before another surfaced. As he tried to process everything, he couldn't help but long for the comfort of his own office, his quiet desk, his piles of research papers, and the certainty that he could simply step away from his work whenever he wished. But here, in the heart of this medieval world, there was no escape. As Richard stood in the grand hall, still trying to wrap his mind around the bizarre reality he found himself in, the servants scurried around, preparing the feast, delivering messages, and ensuring that the royal business was running as smoothly as possible. But for all their efforts, Richard felt more and more disconnected from his surroundings. His crown was heavy, its gold pressing into his skull as if trying to remind him of the responsibilities it represented. "Your Majesty, may I suggest that we proceed with the meeting?" one of the advisors asked again, clearly growing impatient, with his lack of response. The advisor was a stout man with a thick, bushy mustache, his hands clasped in front of him in an almost military fashion. Richard blinked, refocusing. "Yes, of course. Proceed," he said, trying to project authority despite his inner turmoil. The advisor unfurled a large scroll, presenting it to Richard with a flourish. "This is a report on the state of the treasury, as you requested. As you can see, the kingdom's wealth is dwindling. There are several matters that must be addressed immediately, including the allocation of funds for the defense of the southern border." Richard glanced at the scroll, but the words seemed to swim in front of his eyes. The names of distant provinces, detailed accounts of taxes and complex calculations filled the paper. He felt a sudden wave of dizziness. "Your Majesty, are you unwell?" the advisor asked, his brow furrowing in concern. Richard quickly shook his head. "No, I'm fine," he muttered, waving a hand dismissively. But the truth was, he wasn't fine. This wasn't what he had imagined. His entire life had been spent analyzing the past, reading about the decisions kings had made, and yet now, as he faced a kingdom's financial crisis, he had no clue what to do. History had romanticized the life of royalty, painting it as a world of power and luxury. But this was a constant whirlwind of stress and decisions, most of which were far too important to leave to others. A loud knock interrupted his thoughts. The doors of the hall opened, and a messenger rushed in, breathless. "Your Majesty, there is news from the southern province. The rebels are growing in numbers. They demand an audience with you." Richard's heart raced. Rebellions. He'd read about them, of course. Kings and queens were constantly at risk of losing their thrones. But now, facing the very real threat of rebellion, he realized that the danger wasn't just from distant kingdoms or enemies. It was from the very people he was supposed to rule. People who were suffering and angry, desperate for change. They were at his doorstep, and he had no idea how to address them. "Send them away," Richard said, his voice shaking. "Tell them I'm busy. I will speak to them later." The messenger hesitated, but then nodded. As he left the room, Richard sat back heavily in his throne. He felt the eyes of the court on him, waiting for his next move. Their expressions a mixture of expectation and skepticism. "Your Majesty," the advisor said once again, "we must decide how to proceed. Do you wish to send an army to quell the rebellion, or would you prefer to negotiate with their leaders?" Richard stared at the advisor, his mind whirling. He had no military experience, no knowledge of the complexities of warfare. The idea of sending soldiers to kill his own people, his own subjects, was unthinkable. But the alternative was equally daunting. Negotiating with rebels required diplomacy, wisdom, and an understanding of the delicate balance of power. Richard had none of those skills. He had never been trained for this. "Perhaps we can send a delegation," he stammered. "Maybe a peaceful solution is possible." The advisor sighed heavily, exchanging a look with the others in the room. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, a peaceful resolution may no longer be possible. The rebels are becoming bolder by the hour. If you do not act quickly, we risk losing everything." Richard's stomach turned. The pressure was overwhelming. Every decision he made seemed to carry life or death consequences. And yet, he felt like an imposter, someone who had stumbled into a role he was ill-prepared for. As the advisors discussed the details of a potential military response, Richard's mind wandered. He remembered his quiet office back in the modern world, the endless shelves of books, the comfort of being able to look up answers with a few clicks. There was no searching for answers here. There was no Google or Wikipedia to guide him. there were only cold, hard decisions, and the weight of thousands of lives hanging on every choice. The day dragged on. There were more meetings, more reports, more decisions. Richard tried to keep up, but it felt like a tidal wave was crashing over him. And the worst part, he couldn't even take a break. There was no time to rest, no moment to step back and breathe. Every second was filled with demands. People knocking on his door, courtiers seeking his approval, soldiers asking for his orders. The throne wasn't a place of leisure or grandeur. It was a never-ending cycle of pressure, anxiety, and exhaustion. As night fell, Richard found himself seated at a long wooden table in the royal dining hall, surrounded by his advisors and nobles. The feast was more of a formality than a celebration. The food was bland, the wine watered down, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. The nobles whispered amongst themselves, casting sidelong glances at their king, waiting for him to speak, to give them direction, but Richard couldn't find the words. His mind was numb, his body aching from the relentless demands of the day. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake, if he had been wrong to romanticize the idea of ruling. Was this truly the life of a king, or had he been deceived by the stories in his history books? One of the courtiers caught his eye, smiling faintly. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "you must eat. You've been so focused on the kingdom's problems, you've neglected yourself." Richard's stomach churned, but he forced a smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. He took a small bite of the food before him, but it felt like chewing cardboard. Nothing tasted right. Nothing felt right. And as the night wore on, Richard realized something he hadn't fully grasped until now. Ruling was not about luxury or power. It was about the burden of responsibility, the constant pressure, and the fear of losing everything. The life of a king was far from glamorous. It was a life of exhaustion, of constant vigilance, and above all, fear. The next morning, Richard awoke to a sense of dread that weighed heavily on him. His muscles ached from the constant tension of the day before, and the burden of the crown felt even heavier than it had the night before. He had expected the glamour of royalty, the grand feasts, the adoration of his subjects, the endless luxury. But instead, he found himself trapped in a never-ending cycle of decisions that had no easy answers. It was as though the weight of the kingdom's problems pressed down on him, suffocating him with each passing hour. The first sign of trouble came almost immediately. The door to his chambers was flung open by one of his guards, a young man with nervous eyes. "Your Majesty, the royal stables have reported that the horses are ill. They cannot be used for the upcoming royal procession," the guard said, bowing his head low. Richard, still groggy from sleep, blinked in confusion. Horses were an important part of his role as king. How could they be ill? What was he supposed to do about it? His mind scrambled for a solution, but no plan came to him. This was something he'd never read about in his books. There was no historical precedent for it. "I see," Richard murmured, as if the words themselves would conjure an answer. "Find replacements, quickly. We need those horses for the procession." The guard nodded, but Richard could tell that even he was unsure of how to proceed. The reality was that there were no easy solutions, no quick fixes. Richard had always believed that kings had everything under control, that their word was law, and their will absolute. But now he realized the truth was far less glamorous. The kingdom was a fragile machine, and even the smallest malfunction, a sick horse, a miscalculation in the treasury, a wrong decision, could send everything spiraling out of control. As he rose from his bed, another servant entered the room. She handed him a large, leather-bound book, the royal schedule for the day. Richard stared at it for a long moment, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. Meetings, ceremonies, audiences with nobles, diplomats, and military commanders. It felt like there was no room to breathe, no time to think. Every moment was accounted for, every second filled with expectations. "Your Majesty," the servant said, bowing low, "it's time for your morning audience." Richard nodded stiffly, suddenly realizing that there was no escaping this life. His every move was dictated by the demands of his role. There was no personal time, no moments of peace. Even when he slept, his mind raced with the responsibilities. He could never escape. As he walked toward the throne room, he felt a sense of panic rising in his chest. He had no idea how he was going to handle everything. The audience chamber was bustling with activity as nobles and advisors gathered around. Richard took his seat on the throne, the cold stone pressing against his legs. His eyes scanned the room, looking for some sign of familiarity, something that would anchor him in this chaotic world. But all he saw were faces he didn't recognize, voices he didn't understand, and requests that seemed impossibly urgent. A man in a finely tailored tunic approached, bowing low. "Your Majesty, I come to inform you of the latest development at the southern border. The rebels are growing in strength, and they are threatening to march on the capital." Richard felt his heart stop. The rebellion again. It had never really gone away, but now it seemed closer, more immediate. The pressure of dealing with the rebels had been hanging over him all day, and now it was coming to a head. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His advisors, sensing his hesitation, quickly jumped in. "Your Majesty, we must act now. We cannot allow them to advance any further. The kingdom's defenses are weak, and we must gather the army." Richard swallowed, his throat dry. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. The time to make a decision had arrived. His fingers clutched the arms of the throne, his knuckles white with the effort. He could feel the eyes of the court on him, waiting for him to take charge. But how could he? How could he make a decision that would affect the lives of so many people when he didn't even know the first thing about warfare? "What do you suggest then?" Richard finally managed to ask, his voice strained. "What should I do?" One of his military commanders stepped forward, a tall man with a stern face. "Your Majesty, we must mobilize our forces immediately. If we do not act, we risk losing the southern provinces to the rebels, and the capital will be next." Richard nodded, but the words felt hollow. What did he know about commanding an army? The closest he had come to battle was reading about it in his history books, not actually making life and death decisions. The weight of the kingdom, the lives of his people, was now in his hands. But as he sat there, the reality of it all began to set in. He wasn't prepared for this. He had no idea what he was doing. The king's job was not just about making grand speeches and sitting on a throne. It was about managing crises, making tough calls, and living with the consequences of those decisions. Another advisor stepped forward, offering a suggestion to send emissaries to the rebels in hopes of reaching a peaceful resolution. But Richard wasn't sure he believed in diplomacy anymore. It seemed like a weak solution, one that might not even work. The rebels were angry, hungry for change, and no amount of words could undo the years of suffering they had endured. He knew that, deep down. "The army," Richard said finally, his voice firm but unsure. "We have no choice. We'll have to defend the kingdom by force." The chamber fell silent. Richard could feel the weight of his words, the tension in the room thickening. But what choice did he have? The rebellion was spreading, and his kingdom was on the brink of collapse. He wasn't prepared to fail, not yet. The day passed in a blur of orders, decisions, and more endless meetings. Richard was constantly pulled in different directions, trying to balance the needs of his kingdom with his own fear and exhaustion. He barely ate, barely slept, his mind whirring with the weight of his role. As night fell again, Richard sat in his private chambers, staring out over the darkened courtyard. The world was quiet, but his mind was anything but. The crown sat heavy on his head, a constant reminder of his duties, his failures, and the inescapable reality that he was not cut out for this life. As dawn broke over the kingdom of Arcadia, Richard stood at the balcony of his royal chambers, staring out at the horizon. The castle walls were quiet, and the distant sounds of the morning bell echoed across the kingdom. Yet, despite the beauty of the scene, Richard felt none of the peace he had imagined a king might experience. Instead, he felt a cold knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The rebels were no longer a distant threat. They were here, at the gates of the capital, and their demands were growing louder by the hour. The reality of his position was undeniable now. He was no longer just a scholar analysing history from the comfort of his office. He was King Aldrich, and his decisions, his actions, would either save or doom the kingdom. The pressure was unbearable. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Your Majesty, the council requests your presence immediately," a voice called out. Richard sighed, forcing himself to straighten up. He had barely slept. The weight of the crown felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into the responsibilities of his new life. He had been able to escape into research, into the past, when he was a historian. But now, every second felt like a ticking clock. He didn't have time to research solutions. He had to act. He walked to the council chamber, his footsteps echoing down the cold stone hallway. As he entered the room, his advisors and generals stood at attention, waiting for him to speak. The tension in the room was palpable. "Your Majesty, the rebels are marching toward the capital," one of the generals said, his voice tight with urgency. "We have no time left. We must prepare for battle." Richard's mind raced. His earlier decision to send the army had been a desperate choice, and now it was about to come to fruition. The rebellion had moved faster than anyone had anticipated. They were at the gates, and he had no plan beyond the hasty military response. "We cannot afford to wait any longer," the general continued. "If we don't act now, the city will fall. The rebels will not be deterred." Richard swallowed hard. He felt the weight of his decision crashing down on him. If he chose to fight, lives would be lost. His people, his subjects. But if he chose to negotiate, there was no guarantee the rebels would listen. They were angry, and their demands were real. They wanted food, justice, and an end to the suffering that had been inflicted upon them by the nobility. "How many are we facing?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. The general hesitated before answering. "Thousands, Your Majesty. The southern provinces have already fallen. It is only a matter of time before the capital is next." Richard's heart sank. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had read about kings facing rebellion in his books, but reading about it was nothing like living it. The consequences of failure were real, and the fear of losing everything, the kingdom, his crown, his very life, hung over him like a storm cloud. "What is the next step?" Richard asked, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. One of the nobles, a young man with sharp features, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we must consider the lives of the people. The rebellion is fueled by hunger and desperation. Perhaps we should consider offering them provisions, and if we can, reach a peaceful resolution." Richard looked at him, his mind a whirlwind. A peaceful resolution. Could it work? Could he stop the bloodshed? He had no military experience, no understanding of the tactics necessary to win a war. But he did understand the people. He understood their suffering. "Send an emissary," Richard said, his voice firmer now. "We'll offer provisions and attempt to negotiate. But we cannot ignore the threat they pose to the kingdom. Prepare the army, just in case." The general nodded, though he did not look convinced. Richard could see the skepticism in the faces of the other advisors as well. They didn't believe in diplomacy. They believed in power, in force. But Richard had to try. He had to believe that there was still hope for a peaceful solution. As the council dispersed, Richard stood alone in the chamber, the weight of his decision sinking in. Could he really stop a war with words? Could he make the rebels see reason? Or had he already failed them by letting things escalate this far? He walked back to his private chambers, his mind consumed with doubt. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse, and it was his fault. He was the one who had failed to understand the complexity of ruling. He had believed, in his naivety, that being a king meant wearing a crown and giving orders. But now he knew the truth. Ruling was not about power. It was about responsibility, and the constant fear of losing everything. That evening, as Richard prepared for bed, a loud noise echoed from outside the castle walls. The sound of shouting, of movement. He could hear it even from within the stone fortress. The rebels were closing in. He was running out of time. The next few hours were a blur. His emissary returned with word that the rebels had rejected his offer. They were no longer interested in diplomacy. The situation had become dire. The capital was under siege. Richard stood on the balcony once again, staring out at the dark horizon. The city below was alive with chaos, the flickering of torches casting eerie shadows against the stone buildings. It was as if the world had been turned upside down, and everything he had once believed in was crumbling before his eyes. "Your Majesty," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the generals, his face grim. "It's time. The rebels are ready to strike. We must defend the city." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of the moment crushing him. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. It wasn't just the kingdom that was at stake anymore. It was the future of the people he was supposed to protect. And if he failed, it would be more than just his crown that would be lost. It would be the lives of countless innocent people. As the sounds of battle reached his ears, Richard realized the truth. There was no glory in royalty, only fear. Fear of failure, fear of losing everything. And now, he would face the consequences of his actions. The battlefield outside the castle walls was chaos. The sound of clashing swords, the screams of men and horses, and the guttural roars of soldiers filled the air. Richard stood in his royal chambers, staring out the window, unable to tear his eyes away from the madness unfolding before him. He had never imagined it would come to this. Not when he first stepped into the shoes of a king, full of idealistic fantasies about grandeur and power. The weight of his decisions hung over him like an oppressive storm cloud. The rebellion had been his responsibility, his failure. He had been given a chance to save his people, to act decisively, but now it was too late. The kingdom was under siege, and it was all his fault. Richard turned away from the window, his heart racing. His hands trembled as he gripped the sides of his throne, staring at the heavy crown that sat upon his head. The crown, which had once seemed like a symbol of power, now felt like a prison, a cold, unforgiving reminder of the burden of leadership. He had no idea how to fight the rebellion, no clue how to stop the bloodshed. All he had were words, promises of peace that had been rejected, and a crumbling kingdom. He had failed them all, the people, the rebels, the nobles, everyone. The door to his chambers burst open, and one of his advisors entered, his face pale with fear. "Your Majesty, the city walls are compromised. The rebels have breached the outer defenses. We cannot hold them back much longer." Richard's mind spun. His first instinct was to flee, to run back to his quiet life in the modern world. But there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. He was trapped, as much by his decisions as by the crown on his head. If he didn't act now, the kingdom would fall, and with it, the last shred of his dignity. "Is there any way to negotiate?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. "Can we make peace?" The advisor shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. "It is too late for that, Your Majesty. The rebels will not listen. They want blood, not words." Richard's mind raced as he considered his options. There was no army to defend him now. There was no way to stop the chaos from consuming everything he had worked so hard to build. But then, a thought struck him. His life, the life of a historian, had always been spent in the comfort of academia. His true calling had never been to rule. He had never understood what it really meant to govern, to shoulder the weight of an entire kingdom. "Can I leave?" Richard whispered, almost to himself. "Can I just leave?" The advisor blinked, clearly confused. "Your Majesty, where would you go?" Richard stood up, his legs weak, his head spinning. "I don't belong here. I was never meant to be a king. I can't do this." The advisor didn't say anything. He seemed to understand. Perhaps he had seen it in Richard's eyes all along. The exhaustion, the fear, the overwhelming weight of leadership. Richard was no longer a king. He was just a man, desperate to escape a life he never asked for. And then, in that moment of utter clarity, Richard made a decision. He had no way of stopping the rebellion. He had no army, no power, and no strength left to fight. But there was one thing he could still control: his own fate. "Get me out of here," Richard said firmly, his voice breaking through the haze of his panic. "I don't care how. I need to go back. I need to return to my world." The advisor, clearly confused, but sensing the desperation in Richard's voice, nodded. "I will arrange it immediately." Without another word, the advisor left the room, and Richard was left standing alone, staring at the walls of the castle that had once seemed so grand, but now felt like a tomb. He didn't belong here. He had never belonged. His time as King Aldrich had been a nightmare, a cruel joke that had shattered every illusion he had ever held about power and royalty. The door creaked open once more, and the advisor returned, holding a strange device in his hands. It was a small, intricate piece of machinery, unlike anything Richard had seen before. "This will take you back, Your Majesty," the advisor said softly. Richard didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his mind already miles away from the crumbling kingdom that had once been his. He thought of his quiet office, the books, the research, his life as a historian. He had longed to escape into the past, but now he realized that the past was not as glorious as he had imagined. History had lied. Kings were not revered and celebrated. They were prisoners, burdened by the weight of their thrones and the fear of losing everything. With a final glance at the battlefield outside, Richard stepped into the device. A surge of energy filled the room, and in an instant, the world around him shifted. The chaos of the medieval kingdom faded into nothingness, replaced by the familiar sights and sounds of his modern office. He blinked, disoriented, and found himself back at his desk, staring at the research papers before him. The crown was gone. The castle walls had vanished. The rebellion was nothing more than a fading memory. Richard collapsed into his chair, gasping for breath. The weight that had been pressing on him was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could breathe again. The modern world, with all its conveniences, its technology, and its predictable rhythms, felt like a lifeline. He could control his own destiny here. He could research, teach, and write. But ruling was not meant for him. As he sat there, trying to process what he had just experienced, one thought lingered in his mind. Royalty was never as glamorous as it seemed. He had wanted to experience the life of a king, to see history come alive. But what he had learned was that royalty was not about power or luxury. It was about fear of rebellion, fear of failure, and the crushing responsibility of a kingdom that could turn on you at any moment. In the end, being a king was the most misunderstood job of all. Richard stared at his desk, feeling a deep sense of relief. The crown was gone, but the lesson remained. And now, he would never look at history the same way again.